in 1956. Today known as a North American photographer, Norris Webb was originally a poet. As a result of that, her work often interweaves text and photograph, as most notably shown in her monograph entitled My Dakota, an elegy for her brother who died unexpectedly. Her photographic work has appeared in the New Yorker, Le Monde, and the New York Times Magazine, and is in the collections of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the George Eastman Museum in Rochester. Rebecca is a 2019 National Endowment of the Arts grant recipient. Her recent books include her collaborative publication with Alex Webb, entitled Brooklyn, the City Within, and published by Aperture in 2019, and which was also exhibited at the Museum of the City of New York. The upcoming collaborative book, entitled Waves, a pandemic log book on Cape Cod, will be released by Radius in April 2022. But today we are here to talk about her most recent monograph entitled Night Calls, and which works as an homage to her father, who used to be a doctor. For 6 years, Rebecca retraced the route of her father's house calls through the rural Midwestern county, echoing Eugene Smith's Country Doctor series. Most of the pictures are taken at dusk or at dawn to echo her father's work rhythm. Working as a tribute to her now 101-year-old father and his practice as a physician, Night Calls evokes ideas of life and death, labor and care, silence and dialogue, solitude and encounters. Night Calls was published in December 2020, still in the midst of the pandemic, and as such can leave a bitter taste on one as one turns its pages, evoking sickness, forced distance, and sometimes grief. But Night Calls also grapples with notions of benevolence, empathy, humanity, and kindness, so needed during these last 2 years. Whilst working to prepare for this conversation, Rebecca and I have decided to focus on 3 of her images, and as you will see, the PDF of the book will be on the loop here, but I wanted to start our conversation with the photograph entitled Your Sycamore, one of the book's 4 vertical sycamore trees, right? Can you tell us about what these trees mean to you and how they structure the book?
Yes, thank you. They'll be coming up.
Do you mind, putting the microphone closer to your mouth?
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, so the Sycamores, I work very intuitively, and so on my first trips to Rush County, Indiana, I found myself always beginning and ending the trip by photographing a sycamore tree, one of my favorite childhood trees. And then perhaps a year into the project, I began to realize that the tree's mottled bark reminded me of my father's freckled hands. And so in essence, the sycamore tree evolved into a metaphor for him. Additionally, when I was putting together the sequence of the book, I began to realize that the rhythm was very meandering, flowing through time from present to near past to distant past, and also meandering through different kinds of weather, from fog to thunderstorms to cloudy skies. And so the flow was very much like Big Blue River, which my father grew up along on this floodplain in a Quaker enclave, where he and 4 generations of our Quaker family lived along. And so what I decided to do is I took the 4 vertical sycamores and I used them to punctuate the book, which also seems fitting because sycamores are riparian, and so you often find them along the banks of the Big Blue River and other rivers of Rush County.
In the book, you use text as a way to construct diptychs with your images. They can be considered as diary entries or short poems, but also letters directly addressed to your father. Next to your sycamore, the picture I was mentioning earlier on, you wrote, "I look like you I learned to listen to the ache between the words. I'd like to invite you to talk about the conversations started during the making of your collaborative portraits, such as the one of Eleanor, a former patient of your father, and how you did listen to the ache between the words with her.
Yes. So many of the portraits that you see are of my father's former patients, and I'm rather shy, and so I waited until the very last year of the project to make many of the portraits. And I decided I wanted them to be collaborative in some way. So by happenstance, I found my inspiration. I was reading about August Sander and how he worked in the countryside near Cologne, making portraits with the farmers, and they described the way he worked as working like a country doctor making house calls. So I tried my best to channel my father's gentle bedside manner, and I made these collaborative portraits. So for instance, with Eleanor, I started out by her sharing a memory of my father. In this case, she remembered a very dramatic incident where her only son had an alarmingly high fever from scarlet fever, and my father had visited. But what she remembered 50 years later is that the very next morning, my father arrived unannounced to make a second house call just to make sure the danger had passed. And so, I found that these collaborative portraits, not just of Eleanor, but of everyone in the book, in a way, when they were taken together, they also formed, because people were sharing memories and of my father, that in a way they were a kind of a slantwise portrait of him.
Thank you. You mentioned wanting to mimic your father's bedside manners, and I wanted to ask you to add something about this play you create between insider, outsider, as yourself an outsider to their houses and the intimacy, but also of this story being linked through your father, and how you play with it even in the most in the composition of your pictures in a way.
Well, I realized that because many of the experiences that his former patients were telling me were threshold experiences, often describing a birth or a death, that I often used some sort of threshold when I made the portraits. And I worked with that particular patient. And Eleanor, for instance, I used a very large window in the oldest farmhouse in the county. For other people, like Sue Ann, I did the portrait in a doorway.
Thank you. And I would like to talk to you about corn, one of your favorite images from the book. And at first, with my European gaze, I read this photograph as a representation of Americana, an artifact linked to the history or geography of the folklore of the US. And knowing this picture was taken in Indiana, it evoked agricultural production or the Corn Belt. But I know it has a completely different implication or interpretation to you. So can you please explain this picture and what it means to you?
Yes. So corn brings to mind this long tradition of the country doctor. My father was not only one of the last of the country doctors in Rush County, he was also fifth generation country doctor in our family in the same county. And so he followed the traditions of the country doctor, which was if someone had no money, he never refused treatment. People just gave what they could. In many cases, that was, say, a bushel of corn. So with that in mind, I just wanted to read this short piece that accompanies the photograph of the corn. You taught me to accept whatever came to the door, a bushel of corn, 2 porterhouse steaks, a bag of bittersweet horehound candy, your favorite, and the suffering each of us carry, sometimes nearly hidden, except for something about the eyes. how heavy this homemade lemon pie with its mountains upon mountains of meringue.
Thank you for that. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Do we have questions, or shall I continue? Okay, I'll continue. I'll ask maybe one last question about collaboration. It is important in your life as a practitioner with Alex Webb, your husband, but also in this project, collaborating, making those portraits, and in a way collaborating with your father also.
Yes.
Can you tell us about the importance and the place collaboration has in your life and in your practice?
Well, I think that the way that I work, which is very intuitively, is very much a kind of practicing with the world as your collaborator. And one never knows what one will find when you keep yourself open to this sort of collaboration.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so very much for taking the time to talk to us today. Thank you. So I think we'll have